There are some loves that teach you how to live, and some that teach you how to let go. And Edward had learned neither in 800 years until he met her. The archive was tucked away on a narrow street in Bloomsbury, the kind of place you'd walk past a dozen times without noticing, with only a simple brass plaque beside the door that read, "Memory Preservation Services, by appointment only." Inside, the space was warm despite the November chill, with books lining every wall from floor to ceiling, not the decorative kind, but worn, beloved volumes with spines cracked from constant use. A single desk sat near the window, though the heavy curtains were always drawn, and it was at that desk that Edward sat every evening, just after sunset, listening to people tell him their stories. He'd been doing this for 70 years now, and it had become his purpose, his penance, his way of making 8 centuries of existence mean something more than just survival. Edward was a vampire king, though no one who met him in this quiet archive would ever guess it, and the London court had been stable for 300 years under his rule, with peaceful treaties with other territories, careful management of his kind, and no wars or chaos to disrupt the delicate balance between their world and the human one. His second in command, a capable vampire named Marcus, who'd served him for 2 centuries, handled the day-to-day politics now, and Edward had earned his distance from the throne, had earned the right to spend his immortal nights doing something that actually mattered, preserving what time destroyed. Every person who walked through his door brought a lifetime with them, carrying memories and stories and precious moments before age or illness stole them away. And Edward recorded everything with the meticulous care of someone who understood the weight of forgetting. He asked the right questions, remembered every word with perfect clarity, and created beautiful archives, leather-bound books, audio recordings, photograph collections, so that families could hold on to what would otherwise disappear into the void of time. It was the one good thing his curse had given him, perfect, unending memory that forgot nothing. Not a face, not a name, not a single moment in 800 years, which was simultaneously a gift and a torture he carried with him through every endless night. Tonight, like every night, Edward arrived at the archive at 6 p.m., just after the sun had fully set, and November meant early darkness, which he appreciated because it gave him more time for his work. He unlocked the door, turned on the soft lamps that cast warm pools of light across the book-lined walls, and checked the evening's appointments, finding only one name on the schedule: Jane Hartley, age 40, early-onset Alzheimer's disease, referred from St. Mary's Hospital Support Group. Edward felt the familiar weight settle in his chest because Alzheimer's cases were always the hardest, cruelest, watching someone lose themselves piece by piece, well knowing that his perfect memory couldn't save them, could only preserve what they were before the disease took everything. The door chimed at 7 p.m. precisely, and Edward looked up from his desk to see her standing in the doorway, backlit by the street lamp outside, and for a moment, he forgot how to breathe. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, with dark hair pulled back in a simple knot, and green eyes that seemed to take in everything, and a camera bag slung over one shoulder, but because of the way she looked at his archive. With such desperate hope, it nearly broke his heart. Jane stepped inside and closed the door carefully behind her, looking around at the books and comfortable chairs and soft lighting, and something in her posture relaxed slightly as she asked if he was Edward, her voice steady and controlled, though he could hear the fear underneath after 800 years of reading people. He confirmed he was Edward and welcomed her warmly, gesturing to the chair across from his desk, and Jane sat down with the careful precision of someone who couldn't afford to forget where they'd put things, setting her camera bag at her feet before thanking him for seeing her on such short notice. Edward said it was no trouble at all, and asked gently how he could help her, giving her space to gather her courage. Jane took a deep breath and Edward watched her steel herself before she began explaining that she'd been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's 2 years ago when she was 38, and now at 40, the progression had been relatively slow so far, but it was happening. She was forgetting things. Small things at first, like where she'd put her keys or what she'd had for breakfast. But lately, bigger things. Whole conversations and people she'd met, and entire days that just vanished as if they'd never existed. She told Edward she was terrified, not of dying exactly, but of disappearing, of forgetting who she was before she was gone, of ceasing to exist in any meaningful way. Edward listened without interrupting, his hands folded calmly on the desk, though inside he felt the familiar ache of witnessing human suffering. And he'd heard variations of this fear hundreds of times over the decades, but it never got easier to bear. Jane continued, her words coming faster now, as if she needed to get them all out before she forgot what she wanted to say, explaining that she'd been documenting everything obsessively, keeping detailed journals, taking photographs constantly, recording voice memos about her day. But it wasn't enough. She needed someone to organize it, to preserve it properly, to make sure that when she couldn't remember anymore, there would still be a record, proof that she'd existed and mattered and lived. She asked if Edward could help her with that, and he said quietly that yes, he could help her. That was exactly what he did. Jane's relief was visible in the way her shoulders dropped and her breath released, and she asked how it worked, what the process would be. Edward explained his methodology carefully, telling her they would meet regularly, as often as she was comfortable with, and he would interview her about her life, her childhood, her family, her experiences, her loves, her losses, everything that made her who she was. And he would record the sessions, take meticulous notes, help her organize her photographs and journals, and at the end, she would have a complete archive of her life, something permanent that couldn't be forgotten. Jane asked how much it cost, and Edward named a price that was absurdly low, because he never charged what the service was actually worth, knowing most of his clients couldn't afford the true value. And after 800 years of accumulated wealth, money meant nothing to him, while this work meant everything. Jane looked at him for a long moment, with an intensity that made Edward feel she was seeing more than he wanted her to see, reading something in his face or his manner that went beyond the surface. And then, she said simply that they should start, asking when they could begin. Edward suggested they start tonight if she was willing, since they had time, and Jane smiled for the first time, a genuine expression that transformed her face and made Edward feel something shift in his chest, something he hadn't felt in decades. A real and genuine interest in another person that went beyond professional concern. He pushed the feeling away firmly, reminding himself she was a client, a human, a woman with a devastating diagnosis who needed his help and not his inappropriate fascination. But when she smiled at him like that, he couldn't help but smile back. They worked for 3 hours that first night, and Edward asked careful questions while Jane answered them, her voice growing stronger and more animated as she talked, clearly relieved to finally be sharing the burden of her memories with someone who would hold them safely. She told him about growing up in Cornwall, with the sea always present in the background of her childhood, about her parents who still lived there in the same house where she'd been raised, about learning photography from her grandfather, who'd taught her to see light and shadow and the stories hidden in ordinary moments. She spoke about moving to London for university and falling in love with the city's constant motion and endless possibility. About meeting Thomas at a gallery opening when she was 25. And Edward listened to her talk about her husband with an unexpected ache in his chest. Not jealousy exactly, but something more complicated. A mixture of respect and grief for her grief, and a deep, resonant understanding of loss. Jane's voice softened when she spoke about Thomas, becoming tender and sad in equal measure. And she explained that they'd been married for 5 years, that he was a teacher, funny and kind and patient, that they'd been trying for a baby when he died in a sudden, senseless car accident when she was 32. She told Edward she'd never dated anyone after Thomas, had never wanted to, had made peace with being alone because some people got one great love in their life and she'd had hers, and she was grateful for that, even though it ended too soon. Edward found himself saying quietly that he understood that, the having one great love and losing it. And Jane looked at him curiously and asked if he'd been married. Edward said yes, a long time ago. And then, because something about her presence made him want to be honest in a way he rarely allowed himself, he added that it was more than 200 years ago. Jane laughed at what she assumed was a joke, and Edward smiled and didn't correct her, letting her think he was being metaphorical or whimsical. They scheduled their next session for 3 days later, and Jane gathered her things with visible reluctance to leave this safe space, thanking him sincerely before she left. And Edward sat alone in the archive long after she'd gone, with her voice still echoing in his perfect memory. Every word, every inflection, every smile permanently etched into his consciousness. He told himself firmly that this was just another client, just another story to preserve, nothing more than professional duty. But he knew even then that he was lying to himself. Over the next 3 months, Jane came to the archive twice a week with the regularity of ritual. Tuesdays and Fridays at 7 p.m. like clockwork. And Edward found himself looking forward to those evenings with an intensity that should have worried him, but instead felt like waking up after a long sleep. They moved chronologically through her life, with childhood stories giving way to teenage rebellion and young adult adventures, and eventually falling in love. And Jane brought her photographs, thousands of them, beautifully composed images that captured moments of light and shadow and human emotion with an artist's eye. She was talented, genuinely talented, and Edward spent hours between their sessions, carefully scanning and organizing the photographs, creating a comprehensive digital archive with detailed notes about each image. But more than the photographs themselves, he treasured the stories she told about them. Jane had a remarkable gift for narrative, an ability to make the ordinary feel extraordinary through the way she described it, so that a rainy afternoon became an adventure, and a conversation with a stranger became profound, and a sunrise became transcendent. She talked about Thomas with such love and such pain that Edward ached for her, understanding that she'd truly loved her husband deeply and completely, and losing him had nearly destroyed her before she'd somehow found the strength to rebuild her life. But she'd survived and built something meaningful, finding purpose in her photography and in documenting the beauty she saw everywhere. And then the diagnosis. Came and threatened to take even that away from her. One evening in late January, Jane arrived at the archive and couldn't remember Edward's name, standing in the doorway with her face stricken and lost, asking hesitantly if he was the man who was helping her with her memories. Edward said gently that yes, he was Edward, and she was Jane, and she was right on time for their session, keeping his voice calm and reassuring, even as his heart broke for her. Jane's hands were shaking as she sat down, and she told him it was getting worse faster than she'd expected. This morning, she'd forgotten her sister's birthday. This afternoon, she'd gotten lost walking home from the grocery store on a route she'd walked hundreds of times. And she was forgetting the present faster than he could preserve the past. Edward asked quietly what he could do to help, and Jane looked at him with those green eyes, now bright with unshed tears, and asked if he ever felt like he was watching his life slip away, like he was losing himself, piece by piece, and couldn't stop it, no matter what he did. Edward thought about 800 years of perfect memory, every loss and grief and person he'd loved and watched die, all preserved in crystalline detail in his mind, unable to fade or soften or heal through the mercy of forgetting. And he said quietly that, yes, he knew what it felt like to lose yourself, just in a different way than she meant. Jane studied him for a long moment with an intensity that made him wonder what she saw. And then she said softly that she thought there was something different about him, something she couldn't quite name but could sense nonetheless. But sitting here in his archive, talking to him, made her feel safe, like he understood things other people couldn't understand. Edward felt something crack open in his chest at her words, because this woman who was facing the loss of everything she was still felt safe with him. Him, a vampire, a predator, a creature that by all rights shouldn't even exist in her world. And he wanted desperately to tell her the truth, to explain what he was and what he could offer. But it was too soon, and she barely knew him, and the offer of immortality and eternal memory and escape from the disease destroying her would sound insane. So he simply said he was glad she felt safe here, that this space was meant to be a sanctuary for people carrying difficult burdens. And Jane smiled and said they should get back to work, because she wanted to tell him about the year she'd spent in Paris. By March, their sessions had evolved beyond simple interviews into something more intimate and collaborative, with Jane bringing her camera to show Edward her recent work, and he could see the disease's effects in the images. Repeated subjects she didn't remember photographing before, forgotten compositions, moments she'd clearly captured previously but had no memory of. But there was still beauty there, still her unique eye for light and shadow, still her soul captured in silver and pixels. Edward found himself talking more, too, responding to Jane's questions about his life and his work and why he'd chosen this particular calling, and he answered as carefully as he could, editing out the centuries but keeping the truth of his emotions. He told her about loss and about watching people he cared about disappear, about wanting to hold on to something permanent in a world where everything eventually faded away. And Jane said she thought that was beautiful, that he'd turned his own grief into something that helped others carry theirs. Then she asked if he'd ever considered that maybe holding on too tightly was its own kind of prison, its own kind of death. And Edward had no answer for that, because she'd struck directly at the heart of his 800-year existence. One evening in April, Jane arrived with a specific and urgent request, saying she wanted Edward to record her talking about Thomas. Everything about him, their meeting and courtship and marriage and dreams. All of it preserved before she forgot and Thomas disappeared from her memory completely. They worked through the entire night, and Jane talked and cried and laughed in equal measure, speaking about her husband with such vivid love and grief that Edward felt like he was witnessing something sacred. And he recorded every word with meticulous care. He watched her face as she spoke about Thomas, saw the love and the grief and the terrible fear of losing even these precious memories. And at dawn, when Jane had finally exhausted her store of stories about her husband, she thanked Edward with tears streaming down her face and told him she didn't know what she'd do without him, that he'd become something important to her. Edward felt ice and fire in equal measure at her words, because he wanted to be important to her, wanted her to need him. But he also knew with painful clarity how dangerous that was. He was immortal, and she was dying in the slowest and cruelest way possible. And there was no future here, only postponed grief that would be all the more devastating when it finally came. But when she reached across the desk and took his hand, her skin warm and alive and temporary, he didn't pull away, but instead held on like she was the only real thing in his 8 centuries of existence. They sat there in silence as morning light began to seep around the edges of the heavy curtains, and Edward felt the familiar warning tingle on his skin, the instinctive need to retreat from the coming sun that would burn him to ash if he stayed. He told Jane gently that he needed to close the archive now, explaining with a practiced lie that he had morning appointments elsewhere. And Jane looked at the curtained windows and then back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. She asked if he was sensitive to light, and Edward froze completely, his mind racing through possible explanations. But Jane just said her grandfather had been the same way, some kind of rare condition that made sunlight painful, and she didn't press further, just gathered her things and told him she'd see him Friday. Edward sat alone in the archive as the sun rose outside his sanctuary, and realized with a mixture of terror and exhilaration that he was in serious trouble. He was falling in love with Jane Hartley. By May, Edward could no longer pretend this was just professional concern or compassionate interest, because he thought about Jane constantly. Her voice, her stories, her smile, the way she found beauty in ordinary moments, the way she refused to despair even as her mind systematically betrayed her. He started noticing changes in her that marked the disease's progression. She forgot their last session's conversation and asked questions they'd already covered. She got confused about whether they'd already discussed certain memories. She arrived once having forgotten she'd already come earlier that week. The disease was accelerating, and Edward felt helpless to stop it, despite all his power and all his centuries of experience. One evening in late May, Jane asked Edward something that stopped his ancient heart. She asked why he only worked at night, why she'd never seen him in daylight, why he looked exactly the same as he had in a photograph she'd found from a 1952 newspaper article about memory preservation services in London. Edward had been careless, had forgotten that he'd done this same work decades ago under the same name, had thought all those old records were lost or forgotten. But Jane had found one, and her sharp mind, even compromised by disease, had put the pieces together. He looked at Jane sitting across from him, at her intelligent green eyes that saw too much, and made a decision that would change everything. He would tell her the truth. Edward said quietly that he only worked at night because he couldn't go out in daylight, that he looked the same as 70 years ago because he didn't age, that he remembered everything with perfect clarity because his memory was eternal and unchanging, that he was 800 years old and he was a vampire. Jane stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. And then she said she thought she might be having an episode, that the Alzheimer's was making her confused and she was hearing things that weren't real. Edward said gently but firmly that no, she wasn't confused. He was telling her the truth, and to prove it, he let his eyes shift to that reflective predator shine, let his fangs extend just slightly, let her see what he really was beneath the careful human mask he wore. Jane should have run, should have been terrified, should have screamed or fainted or fled into the night. But instead, she leaned forward with her eyes wide and asked if that was why he understood, why he knew what it was like to lose yourself, but in a different way. Whether having perfect memory of 800 years of loss was its own kind of hell. Edward felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries, tears burning in his eyes, threatening to fall. And he said, yes, exactly that. It was exactly that kind of hell. Jane reached across the desk and took his hand again, and she told him she was sorry, that carrying that much loss and grief and memory must be unbearable. And Edward laughed, the sound broken and raw, because here she was, facing the complete loss of her entire self, and she was offering him sympathy for his burden. Jane said simply, "That was what you did when you cared about someone. You held their pain even when you had your own, especially then." And Edward felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what it meant to love someone. Then Jane asked the question Edward had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. She asked if he could turn her, if he could make her like him so she wouldn't forget anymore, so she could keep herself forever. Edward closed his eyes and said yes. He could do that. It was within his power. But he asked her if she'd thought about what that would really mean, beyond just not forgetting. Jane said she'd thought about nothing else since she'd figured out what he was, which had been about 3 weeks ago. Edward's eyes snapped open in shock, and Jane smiled slightly and told him she might be losing her short-term memory, but she wasn't stupid. The pieces had all been there. His avoidance of daylight, and his anachronistic speech patterns, and the way he talked about historical events like he'd personally witnessed them, and that old photograph. And she'd just needed time to accept the impossible truth. She asked again, more urgently this time. Could he turn her? Could he save her from forgetting everything? Could he give her eternity? Edward wanted to say yes more than he'd wanted anything in 800 years. Wanted it so desperately it physically hurt. But he forced himself to be completely honest about what she was asking for. He told her that yes, he could turn her, and she would become immortal and ageless. Her mind would freeze at this exact moment and be preserved forever. She'd never forget another thing for the rest of eternity. But, and he emphasized this with absolute seriousness, she would never see sunlight again. Never feel its warmth on her skin. Never watch another sunrise, because the sun would burn her to ash in seconds. She would have to drink blood to survive, taking life to sustain her own. She would watch everyone she loved age and die, while she stayed frozen and unchanging. She would lose her humanity slowly over the centuries, becoming something other, something not quite human anymore. She would have eternity, but it would come at a cost that might be greater than she could imagine. Jane listened to all of this with careful attention, and then she asked if she could have time to think about it, to really consider what she wanted. Edward said of course, take all the time she needed. There was no pressure and no rush. Jane left that night without scheduling another session, telling Edward she would call him when she'd made her decision, and he watched her disappear into the London night, wondering if he'd just lost her forever. 1 week passed without word from Jane, then 2 weeks, then 3, and Edward didn't hear from her at all, despite checking his phone obsessively. He told himself it was fine, that she'd made her choice, and it was probably the right one, the wise one, choosing mortality and life's natural ending over the curse of immortality. But his archive felt desperately empty without her presence. The evenings stretched endlessly, and his perfect memory tortured him with every word she'd said, every smile, every moment they'd shared. He'd fallen in love with her, completely and impossibly, and she'd walked away, and he had to accept that. In the 3rd week of her absence, Jane finally called, and Edward's dead heart lurched at the sound of her voice. She asked if she could come to the archive that evening, because she had her answer. And Edward said yes immediately. Any time, she was always welcome. She said she'd be there at 7, and Edward spent the hours before sunset pacing his archive like a caged animal, telling himself to be prepared for either answer, to accept her choice, whatever it was, to support her decision, even if it broke him. Jane arrived at 7 p.m. exactly, and she sat down across from Edward with a determined expression and said she'd made her decision. She wasn't going to turn. She was choosing to remain human and mortal and finite. Edward felt something shatter inside him, like glass breaking, but he kept his face carefully calm and asked if she was absolutely certain. Jane said yes, she was certain, and then she explained why, in words that would echo in Edward's mind for the rest of his very long existence. Jane told him about the sunrises she'd been watching every morning since their last conversation, really watching and really experiencing them, paying attention to the way the light changed from black to blue to pink to gold, the way the world gradually woke up, the way it felt to be alive and present in that precious moment. She said that was what she'd miss most if she turned, not just the physical sun, but the knowing that each sunrise was precious specifically because there were only a limited number of them left, that beauty and meaning came from impermanence, not from eternal preservation. She told Edward that life was beautiful because it ended, because the sun set every evening, because we forgot the pain and gradually remembered only the love. She said she'd loved her husband Thomas deeply, and yes, it hurt that she was forgetting the specific details of his face and the exact sound of his voice. But she was also grateful in a strange way. Grateful that she got to forget the worst parts, like the phone call from the hospital and the funeral, and the first terrible year of grief so heavy she could barely breathe. she said. What remained now was just the feeling of having been loved. And that was enough. That was actually more than enough. Jane explained that she'd been holding on to Thomas so tightly for 8 years that she'd forgotten how to live. And maybe forgetting was the only way she could finally heal and make space for something new in her life. She told Edward he'd been holding on to everything for 800 years. Every loss, every pain, every grief, every person he'd ever loved and lost. And maybe that wasn't really living. Maybe that was just existing in the past, unable to move forward because he couldn't forget anything. Edward told her quietly that she was right about all of it, that she'd seen through him with devastating clarity. But he said he still couldn't bear to watch her fade away, to watch her forget him and forget herself, and forget everything that made her who she was. Jane smiled sadly and said that was why she'd come back to see him, to ask him for a promise. Edward asked what promise she needed from him, and Jane told him she needed him to keep her alive the only way that truly mattered. In memory, in the stories he would tell, in the archive they'd built together over these months. She told him that people died twice, once when they stopped breathing, and once when no one spoke their name anymore, when no one remembered them, when they faded completely from the world's memory. She said that was why she'd come to him in the first place, not just to preserve her memories for herself before they vanished, but to give them to him, to someone who would never forget, someone who would keep her alive long after her brain could no longer hold on to who she was. Edward said he couldn't do it, couldn't just stand by and watch her disappear piece by piece. It was too much to ask. Jane asked gently what the alternative was. Forcing her to turn against her will, taking away her choice, making her into something she didn't want to be? Edward said no, never that. He would never force her. Jane said then he had to let her go, had to let her live what remained of her life the way she wanted to live it. In the sun, making new memories even if she'd forget them. Being fully human, experiencing the beauty of mortality. She asked if he could do that, if he loved her enough to let her choose this path, even though it would hurt him. Edward felt something break open inside him, all his careful walls crumbling, and he said that yes, he did love her, had loved her for months now, loved her wisdom and her strength, and her absolutely terrifying courage in the face of losing everything. Jane's face softened, and she said she loved him too, that he'd reminded her what it felt like to let someone in, to trust someone, to believe that maybe her life wasn't over just because she was dying. And she said that was a gift she would treasure for however long she could still remember it. She told Edward she wanted to give him a gift too, and she asked him to stop holding on to everything so tightly, to let some of it go, to forgive himself for all the losses he couldn't prevent, to understand that forgetting wasn't weakness, it was mercy. It was healing. It was the way humans were meant to process grief. She said when she was gone, she wanted him to remember her, but not the way he remembered everything else, with perfect and painful clarity. She wanted him to let the memory soften over time. Let it fade a little. Let it hurt less. Let it heal the way memories were supposed to heal. She said that was what she wanted for him more than anything. freedom from his perfect memory, peace from his endless grief, permission to let go. Edward told her he didn't know if he could do that after 8 centuries of holding on to everything. And Jane said gently that he had time to learn. And she asked if they could spend her remaining good time together. Not as vampire and dying human, not as immortal and mortal, just as Edward and Jane. 2 people who understood each other and cared about each other and wanted whatever time they had left. Edward said yes with his voice breaking. God, yes. Yes to all of it. They spent the next 3 years together, and Jane's decline was gradual at first, and then suddenly steep. With good days where she remembered everything, and bad days where she barely knew her own name. Edward was there for all of it, through every stage and every change. And he took her to galleries to see photographs, read to her when she got confused by written words, held her when she cried from frustration at her failing mind, reminded her patiently who she was on the days when she forgot. He watched her watch the sunrise every single morning from her apartment window, standing in the shadows where the light couldn't reach him. And he gradually began to understand what she meant about the beauty of impermanence, about how knowing something would end made it more precious rather than less. He met her sister and her parents and her friends, attending her medical appointments and holding her hand through difficult conversations about care facilities and end-of-life planning. And he became part of her life in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be part of anyone's life in decades. He let himself love her fully and completely, knowing it would end, knowing he would lose her, knowing the grief would be devastating. And he did it anyway, because she'd taught him that love didn't require forever to be real and meaningful. Jane forgot Thomas eventually, forgot his name and his face, and the fact that she'd ever been married. And it hurt her at first, before she forgot enough that she didn't remember to be hurt anymore. But Edward kept Thomas alive for her, telling her stories about her husband whenever she seemed confused about her past, about the man she'd loved and married. And he honored that first great love, even as he lived this second one, understanding that Jane contained multitudes, and all of her loves deserved to be remembered. In Jane's final lucid week, when she was 46 years old, 9 years after her diagnosis, she told Edward something that would change the trajectory of his entire existence. They were sitting in her room at the care facility where she'd moved when she could no longer safely live alone, and sun was streaming through the window in golden afternoon light, and Jane was having one of her increasingly rare good days where she recognized him and could speak clearly. She asked Edward if he remembered all their conversations, every single one, every word they'd ever said to each other. And Edward said yes. He remembered everything with perfect clarity. Jane said good. That was good. And then she told him she wanted him to know that she'd made the right choice, that these last few years, even with the fear and the confusion and the gradual loss of herself, had been beautiful, that loving him had been beautiful. And she hoped he would remember that, not the disease and not the ending, but the love and the choice and the sunrises and the beauty they'd found together. She made him promise again, made him swear that he would keep her alive in memory, that he would tell her story, that she wouldn't just disappear as if she'd never existed. Edward promised with tears streaming down his face. And Jane asked him one final thing. She asked him to let himself be happy after she was gone. To not carry her loss the way he'd carried all his other losses for 800 years. To let it soften and fade and heal. To let himself live instead of just existing. Edward said he didn't know how to do that. And Jane told him with complete confidence that he'd figure it out, because he was very clever and she had faith in him. She smiled, reached up to touch his face with a hand that trembled slightly, and said thank you for everything. For seeing her, for loving her, for letting her choose, for keeping her promise to keep her alive. Then she asked him to open the curtain wider because she wanted more sun. And Edward opened the curtain as far as it would go, while staying carefully in the shadows himself. And Jane closed her eyes and lifted her face to the golden light with an expression of pure contentment, whispering that it was beautiful. It was so beautiful. 2 months later, at age 47, Jane died on a spring morning with sunlight streaming through her window. Edward had been there through the night, sitting in the darkened corner where the approaching dawn couldn't reach him. And Jane hadn't recognized him for weeks, hadn't recognized anyone, had been mostly unresponsive, with her mind already gone, even though her body continued. But at the very end, just before the sun fully rose, she opened her eyes and looked toward the window where pale light was just beginning to show. And she smiled one last time and whispered a single word. Beautiful. And then she was gone. Edward sat with her body until the sun got too high and he had to retreat. Safety. And then he made all the necessary calls, notified her family, made the funeral arrangements, moving through the practical necessities in a fog of grief so profound it felt like drowning. At the funeral 3 days later, he stood in the very back of the church where shadows pooled deepest, and he listened to people talk about Jane. Her sister sharing stories about their childhood, her father speaking about her talent for photography, her friends remembering her kindness and her laughter, and her incredible strength. No one mentioned him or acknowledged his presence. And he was just the man who'd helped with her archive, a service provider, and no one knew he'd loved her, or that she'd loved him, or that they'd spent 3 years building something precious and impossible together. And that was fine. That was exactly how it should be. Because his love for Jane didn't need to be public or acknowledged. It just needed to be real. And it was the realest thing he'd felt in 800 years. After the funeral, Edward returned to his archive and spent weeks organizing Jane's complete memory collection. All her journals and photographs and recordings and the stories she'd told him. Everything compiled into a beautiful, comprehensive archive. He contacted her family and gave it to them, and they were grateful and tearful, telling him he'd given them an incredible gift. And he said quietly that Jane had given him one first, though he didn't explain what he meant. Then, Edward did something he hadn't done in 70 years. He closed his archive, locked the door, and didn't return. Because he couldn't. Not yet. Not when every corner of that space held Jane's voice, and Jane's laughter, and Jane's presence. And his perfect memory wouldn't let him forget a single moment. He retreated to his duties as Vampire King, and his second-in-command, Marcus, was relieved to have him back, even though he was clearly worried about Edward's empty demeanor. Edward performed his responsibilities mechanically, attending councils and making judgments, and maintaining the peace he'd built over centuries. But he felt hollowed out and empty, like something essential had been carved out of his chest. Jane was gone, truly gone, and his perfect memory kept her alive in such vivid and painful detail that it felt like losing her over and over again, every single night. He remembered every word she'd said, every smile, every moment, every sunrise she'd watched with such joy, and it hurt more than anything in his 800 years of existence. One evening, 6 months after Jane's death, Edward was going through her remaining belongings, things her family had asked him to sort, since he'd known her so well in those final years. And he found a letter addressed to him in Jane's handwriting from years ago, when her hand was still steady and sure. The letter was dated the week after she'd decided not to turn, and Edward opened it with hands that shook, despite centuries of vampire control. Jane's words were clear and loving, and absolutely devastating in their wisdom. She wrote that she knew he would be reading this after she was gone, that his perfect memory would be torturing him with her loss in excruciating detail, and she wanted to tell him something important that she hoped he would hear. She wrote that she'd made her choice not because she didn't love him. She did, desperately and completely, but because she loved him too much to trap him with her forever in immortal stasis. She said she'd watched him carry 800 years of perfectly preserved loss, and she couldn't add to that impossible burden by making him watch her become something other than human, by forcing her own memories to freeze rather than following the natural cycles of remembering and forgetting. She'd chosen mortality because that was the real gift, the beauty of an ending, the mercy of forgetting, the peace of letting go, the knowledge that everything precious was also temporary, and that was what made it precious. Then she wrote something that made Edward's breath stop completely in his chest. She wrote that she knew there was a way for vampires to become human again, that she'd researched it extensively and found the old legends and understood it was possible, and she wanted him to know about it, not as pressure, not as expectation, but as an option, as a choice he could make for himself. She wrote that if 800 years was enough, if he was tired of carrying everything, if he wanted to experience what she'd tried to explain to him about the beauty of impermanence and the gift of an ending, and the freedom that came with mortality, then that path existed and was available to him. She wrote that she would never ask him to do it, would never expect it, but she wanted him to know he could choose it if he wanted to. That choosing mortality wasn't weakness or defeat. It was courage. It was wisdom. It was understanding that holding on forever wasn't the same thing as living. She ended the letter by saying she loved him more than she could express in words, that knowing him had been one of the great and unexpected joys of her life, that she hoped he would remember her with softness instead of pain, that she hoped he would learn to let go the way she'd let go, that she hoped he would find peace. Edward read the letter 3 times, and then he sat in the darkness of his empty rooms and thought about 800 years of existence. He thought about his kingdom, stable and peaceful and well-governed, no longer needing his direct involvement. He thought about his perfect memory, beautiful in its completeness and agonizing in its inability to heal. He thought about Jane, gone but never forgotten, preserved in his mind with such clarity it hurt. He thought about life and death and love and loss and the vast space between. And he thought about sunrises. For the first time in 800 years, Edward seriously considered an ending. Considered mortality. Considered choosing to let go. It took him 6 more months to make the decision, and he didn't make it lightly or impulsively, spending that time putting all his affairs in order with meticulous care. He formally passed his crown to Marcus, who had proven himself wise and capable over 2 centuries of service. And Edward knew his kingdom would be fine without him. Possibly even better, since Marcus brought fresh energy to leadership. He spoke extensively with the oldest members of his court, vampires who'd known him for centuries and had watched him change over the decades. And they told him he'd softened in ways they'd never expected. That he seemed tired in a way that immortality couldn't fix. And they said quietly that they understood his choice. And some of them looked envious that he'd found a way out. Edward researched the spell thoroughly, confirming that it was real and ancient and forbidden, but possible. And he learned that a witch in the oldest part of London held the knowledge necessary to perform the transformation. He went to her on a cold November night, exactly 1 year after Jane's death. And the witch was ancient, even by vampire standards, with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. She asked Edward directly why he wanted this. Why a vampire king with power and wealth and eternal life would choose mortality and limitation and eventual death. Edward told her about Jane without holding anything back, about learning that holding on too tightly was its own kind of death, about 800 years being enough, about wanting to experience an ending instead of an endless existence, about being ready to let go of everything he'd been carrying. The witch studied him for a long moment with those ancient eyes. And then she said she would help him. But she warned him clearly about what the spell would do. She explained that the spell would make him mortal and human, but it wouldn't make him young. He would age naturally from this point forward. But he would start at the physical age he'd been when he was first turned into a vampire. He'd been 28 years old when he became immortal, so he would be 28 again as a human. And he would have perhaps 50 or 60 years of mortal life ahead of him. Maybe less, maybe more, depending on how he lived and how his body aged. Edward said that was enough. That was more than enough. That 50 years of real living was worth more than eternity of just existing. The witch performed the spell over 3 consecutive nights, and it was agony unlike anything Edward had ever experienced, feeling like dying and being born at the same time. Like everything immortal and unchanging in him was being systematically burned away and replaced with something fragile and temporary and terrifyingly human. On the 3rd night, when the spell finally completed, Edward felt his heart beat differently, stronger, more insistent, more alive in a way it hadn't been for 8 centuries. He felt hunger that was real and urgent instead of the controlled thirst for blood. He felt exhaustion pulling at his body, demanding sleep in a way he'd forgotten. He felt mortal and alive and temporary, and it was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The witch told him there was one more thing he needed to consider carefully, and she explained that while the spell had made him mortal, His vampire memory remained intact and perfect. He would still remember everything from his 8 centuries, unless he chose differently. She said she could modify the spell one final time to make his memory human and imperfect, capable of forgetting, capable of healing through the gradual loss of painful details. And it would cost him nothing extra, since he'd already paid for the transformation. Edward stood in the witch's chamber and thought about Jane's words about letting memories soften, and forgetting being mercy, and healing through the natural process of time. And he asked the witch to do it, to make him fully human, to let him forget the way humans forgot. The witch placed her hands gently on Edward's temples and told him his important memories would remain. He wouldn't lose himself or his core experiences, but the perfect clarity would fade gradually. The painful details would soften and blur, and he would heal the way humans healed, through time and through the mercy of imperfect memory. Edward closed his eyes and felt something release in his mind, like a dam breaking. 800 years of perfect memory beginning to blur the edges and soften, and become bearable for the first time in his long existence. When it was done, Edward thanked the witch sincerely, paid her with the last of his considerable vampire wealth, and then he walked out into the London night as a mortal human man for the first time since 1224. The next morning, Edward did something he hadn't done in 800 years. He watched the sunrise without fear or pain. He stood in Kensington Gardens, in the same spot where Jane had photographed the dawn light 1,000 times, and he watched the sky change gradually from black to deep blue, to soft pink, to brilliant gold. And he felt the sun's warmth on his face for the first time in centuries. It didn't burn or hurt or threaten him with destruction. It was just warm and beautiful and life-giving. And Edward finally understood completely what Jane had been trying to tell him all along. This moment was precious, specifically because it was finite. Beautiful because it would end in a few hours when the sun set again. Real because it was temporary, and he was temporary, and everything was temporary. Edward laughed out loud, the sound echoing across the empty park in the early morning. And for the first time in 800 years, he felt genuinely and completely free. He spent the next 30 years really living instead of just existing. He reopened his archive after a year of grief, but he ran it differently now, still helping people preserve their memories, but not carrying them with the perfect and painful clarity he'd had before. Letting his human memory do what it was designed to do. Hold the important parts. Let the rest gradually fade. Heal through the natural process of time. He created a foundation in Jane's name called the Jane Hartley Memory Project, and it helped families dealing with Alzheimer's, provided resources for memory preservation, funded research into treatments, and ensured that no one struggling with memory loss felt alone or forgotten. He made Jane matter, kept her alive in the world the way she'd asked him to, made sure her story helped others. But he also lived his own life fully and without reservation. He made friends who didn't know about his past, dated occasionally, though no one ever quite measured up to Jane, and he didn't expect them to. Traveled to places he'd only seen in darkness before, and experienced things he'd never let himself experience as a vampire. Real risk, and genuine uncertainty, and the beautiful vulnerability of being mortal. He felt pain when he got sick or injured. He felt exhaustion that came from honest work. He felt joy that was sharp and bright because he knew it wouldn't last forever. He felt alive. His memory of Jane softened over the years exactly as she'd wanted it to. And he didn't forget her, could never forget her. But the sharp edges gradually dulled into something gentler. The pain became bittersweet nostalgia. The loss transformed into gratitude for having known her at all. He remembered her laughter more clearly than her tears, her wisdom more vividly than her illness, her choice and courage more than her decline. He kept 2 photographs in a locket he wore always, one of Jane smiling in sunlight, and one of her husband, Thomas, honoring both loves in her life the way she would have wanted. On the 30th anniversary of Jane's death, Edward returned to Kensington Gardens, where this new phase of his life had begun. He was 58 years old now in human years, his hair graying at the temples, and his body starting to show the signs of age. And he'd been feeling his heart struggle lately with an irregular rhythm that told him his time was growing short. He knew, with the deep instinct of someone who'd faced death before, that he probably had months rather than years left. Maybe a year if he was fortunate, but certainly not much more than that. But he wasn't afraid, not even a little bit, because Jane had taught him that endings were gifts. He stood in the exact spot where he'd watched his first sunrise as a mortal man 3 decades ago, the same place Jane had loved, and he watched the sun rise over London one more time, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and orange. Edward closed his eyes and felt the warmth on his face, and he thought about Jane, about her smile and her strength, and her impossible wisdom that had changed his entire existence. He thought about 800 years of perfect, immortal memory and 30 years of imperfect human life, and he knew without any doubt which had felt more like real living. He touched the locket around his neck, with Jane's and Thomas's photographs inside, and he whispered to the sunrise and to her memory, "Thank you for teaching me to let go. Thank you for showing me that life is beautiful because it ends. Thank you for loving me enough to let me choose this. I kept my promise. I kept you alive in memory and in the work we do in your name. But now, I think I'm ready to let go. Ready to find out what comes next. Ready to stop existing and truly rest." The sun climbed higher in the sky, and birds sang their morning songs, and the world woke up around him with all its noise and beauty and temporary glory. Edward opened his eyes and smiled, feeling more at peace than he'd felt in 8.5 centuries. And he was mortal and free, and he had lived, really lived, and that was enough. That was more than enough. He walked home slowly through the morning light, taking his time, noticing everything. The way the light filtered through the trees, the sound of the city waking up, the smell of coffee from a cafe, the feeling of being alive and present and temporary. He had work to do still, people to help, memories to preserve, a few more sunrises to watch. He had time left. Not much, but enough. And he would use it well. And when his ending finally came, he would face it the way Jane had taught him, with courage and gratitude, and his face turned toward the sun, understanding that life was beautiful because it ended, and love was beautiful because it cost something, and memory was beautiful because it could heal, and forgetting was a mercy. And holding on forever wasn't living. It was just being too afraid to let go. 800 years as a vampire had taught Edward about immortality and power and perfect memory. 30 years as a human had taught him about life and love and the courage to let go. And Jane, in her brief and brilliant 47 years, had taught him the most important lesson: that love didn't need forever to be real. It just needed to change you, to make you better, to teach you something essential about being alive. Edward lived for 2 more years after that 30th anniversary, dying peacefully at age 60 in his sleep, with Jane's photograph on his bedside table and the curtains open to let in the morning light. His foundation staff found him with a smile on his face, and they said it looked like he'd been dreaming of something beautiful. The Jane Hartley Memory Project continued for decades after Edward's death, helping thousands of families preserve memories and supporting research that eventually led to better treatments for Alzheimer's disease. Jane's archive became famous in memory preservation circles, a model for how to honor someone's life with dignity and love. Her photographs were exhibited in galleries across London and beyond. Her story was told and retold, inspiring others facing similar diagnoses. She didn't disappear or fade from the world. She was remembered. Her life mattered. Her choice meant something. And Edward, the man who'd helped preserve her memory and then chosen to join her in mortality, was remembered too. Not as a vampire king or an immortal creature of darkness, but as a man who understood that life's beauty lay in its ending, that love didn't require eternity, that memory could heal, that forgetting was mercy, that letting go was the greatest and hardest and most necessary act of love. In the archives of the Jane Hartley Memory Project, there's a leather-bound book containing Jane's complete story, and on the very final page, written in Edward's distinctive handwriting, are these words that sum up everything he learned in 8 centuries of existence and 30 years of life. We're not truly dead as long as we are remembered, but we are not truly alive until we learn to let go. Jane taught me both truths. She taught me that life is a gift because it ends, that love is a gift because it costs us something precious, that memory is a gift because it can soften and heal, that forgetting is a gift because it allows us to move forward. She taught me that 800 years of perfect memory was a prison, and 30 years of imperfect human life was freedom. I loved her completely. I lost her inevitably. I let her go finally. And in letting her go, I learned at last to truly live. This is her story. This is our story. This is the story of how a dying woman taught an immortal creature what it meant to be alive, to love without requiring forever, to hold precious things with an open hand. Remember her, but let the memory be gentle. let it be kind. Let it be what she wanted, not an anchor holding you to the past, but a gift reminding you that you were here, that you loved, that you mattered, that you lived fully in the time you had. And that is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything worth remembering.